My name is Emily Hayes. I am 42 years old, a mother of two, divorced, and I have spent the last 9 years building a business from the ground up, quietly, carefully, and completely alone. Last Thanksgiving, my father looked across the dinner table, laughed, and called me worthless. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. He meant every word. What he did not know was that I had already built something powerful enough to change everything he thought he understood about success, and about me. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. The turkey was still on the table when my father picked up his beer and said it. I don't know why you even came. He laughed, shaking his head slowly like I was a mild disappointment he had learned to live with. You dropped out. You sell little tables and fix up projects online. You're uneducated. He paused, looking right at me. And honestly, Emily, you're worthless. The word landed differently than I expected. Not like a slap, more like something cold pressed flat against my chest. My mother looked down at her plate immediately. My brother Daniel leaned back in his chair and smirked at the ceiling. I was 42 years old, sitting at the same dining table where I had learned, as a little girl, to keep my mouth shut and my feelings invisible. But this time I did not cry. I looked at my father steadily and said, very quietly, "You really believe that?" He did not hesitate for even a second. "Yes," he said, and picked up his fork. Daniel stretched his arms behind his head and smiled the way he always smiled when he felt like he had already won something. "Dad built a real company," he said. "Some of us stepped up to help carry that forward. Some of us." As if there had ever been an invitation for me to step up alongside him. I watched my father clap Daniel on the back. That warm, proud clap I had been watching my whole life. Always directed at Daniel, always just slightly out of my reach no matter how hard I worked or how quietly I achieved. Daniel was the golden child. He had nearly bankrupted the company once, 3 years earlier, through a bad partnership deal that my father quietly unwound before anyone outside the family found out. Nobody called Daniel worthless for that. That night, as I gathered my coat to leave, Daniel followed me out to the driveway. He stood in the cold with his hands in his pockets and said softly, almost gently, "You should stop trying to compete, Emily. It doesn't suit you." Compete. That single word told me more than the whole dinner had. Here is what my father did not know, and what I had never told him. I did not drop out of college because I was lazy or lost or unfocused. I left because the tuition money I had been counting on that semester quietly disappeared. It took me years to piece together exactly where it went. Daniel had crashed his truck that spring and needed legal help and a new vehicle. My parents handled it without telling me. By the time I understood what had happened, the semester was already gone. I could have made noise about it. Instead, I paid my own way back. I finished my degree online at night, while working during the day, while going through my divorce, while raising 2 kids who needed a mother who showed up every single morning regardless of how tired she was. I never told my father any of that. Partly because I was proud. Partly because I wanted to understand something important first. I wanted to know exactly who he believed I was when he had no credentials to evaluate. Now, at that dinner table, I finally had my answer. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, my father called me. Not to apologize. That was never going to happen, and I had stopped expecting it. "Daniel mentioned you've been doing some small property work," he said. His tone was the particular kind of casual that people use when they want something but don't want to admit it. "Little flip projects, right? We're expanding into mid-size residential development. Probably too complex for what you're used to, but I thought I'd mention it." I sat at my desk with the phone against my ear and looked out the window at the parking structure of the building I owned 2 blocks away. "That sounds interesting," I said calmly. "It's a big step up," he continued. "Real capital involved. Real risk management." I almost told him then. The words were right there ready. Instead I said, "I appreciate you thinking of me," and ended the call. He had no idea I already owned 8 mid-size residential buildings. all in the same county where his company operated. All profitable. All managed without a single default. The call that changed everything came from a woman named Petra, a former operations manager from my father's company, who had left 6 months earlier under circumstances she described only as not worth explaining. She called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if we could speak privately. "I need you to understand I'm not doing this out of spite," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you're the only person in your family who will actually listen." She told me the company's cash flow had been deteriorating for over a year. Daniel had signed off on a financing structure for a new development project that had looked ambitious on paper and was proving catastrophic in practice. She sent me a public filing that evening. Nothing leaked, nothing stolen, just public record that anyone could access if they knew where to look. I spent 2 hours reading through it. The numbers were not subtle. They had leveraged nearly everything the company owned against a single large project. If that project ran over budget or timeline, and the early indicators suggested it would do both, the bank would have legal grounds to move on multiple properties simultaneously. My father had no idea how exposed he was. Daniel apparently did, and had said nothing. I did not feel triumphant when I understood the full picture. I felt genuinely frightened. Because this was not just a company to me, no matter how my father had treated me. This was my grandfather's work. A man who had built something honest from nothing, who had taken my father in as a young man and taught him everything. The company carried our family name. More than that, it was the foundation of my mother's financial security. The house they lived in. Their retirement. If Daniel's gamble failed and the bank moved in, my mother would lose everything she had counted on for decades. She was not young. She was not well positioned to start over. She had trusted the men in her life to manage things responsibly, and one of those men had been quietly steering toward a cliff. My father would never in a million years ask me for help. His pride would not allow it. Which meant I had to find another way in before the whole thing collapsed under its own weight. At Sunday dinner the following month, Daniel was in an expansive mood. He poured wine for everyone and told the table about the company's next big move with the confidence of a man who had decided the details would sort themselves out. "Cedar Ridge closes next month," he said. "Biggest project we've ever touched. This is going to put us in a completely different league." Cedar Ridge. I set my fork down quietly. I had looked at that land myself 6 months earlier during my own research into available parcels in the county. I had read the soil assessment reports that the seller had made available in the due diligence package. The foundation risk on that land was significant, not impossible to manage, but it required specific construction approaches and added costs that would compress margins considerably. I had passed on it for exactly that reason. Daniel, apparently, had not read those reports carefully. Or perhaps he had and decided the risk was acceptable. Either way, he was now about to close a deal that could trigger the collapse of everything else. I sat at that dinner table and understood that I had a choice. I could watch it happen and feel nothing. Or I could step in, knowing my father might not thank me, and try to save what was left of my grandfather's legacy. I contacted the bank the following week. Not dramatically, simply as a potential investor conducting research on development activity in the county. I asked general questions about construction financing trends in the area. The loan officer I spoke with was professional and measured until I mentioned my last name in passing. She paused. "You're related to the Hayes Development Group?" "Yes," I said. "They're family." There was a longer pause than the question warranted. "Ms. Hayes," she said carefully, "I can't discuss specific accounts. But if you're doing research on development risk in this market, I'd suggest looking closely at projects with compressed timelines and variable soil conditions." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. When I hung up, I understood the full situation clearly for the first time. The bank was already concerned. One missed payment, possibly even one delayed draw request, and they would have grounds to accelerate the loan. The company was not approaching a cliff. It was already standing at the edge. The rains came in February, 6 weeks after Cedar Ridge broke ground. They were heavier than the seasonal forecast had predicted, and they continued longer than anyone planned for. Construction stopped for 11 days. When work resumed, The crew discovered that sections of the foundation prep had shifted. The soil reports I had read 6 months earlier had flagged exactly this possibility under sustained moisture conditions. Costs doubled almost immediately. The revised timeline pushed the projected completion back by 4 months, which meant the financing structure, built around an aggressive draw schedule, began to buckle. My father called a family meeting at his house. Daniel blamed the contractors. The contractors, through their project manager, sent a formal letter back attributing the delays to site conditions that had been documented in the original assessment. My father turned to me at one point during the meeting, I think because I was the only person in the room who had not yet spoken, and said, almost reflexively, "You wouldn't understand the complexity of something like this." I looked at him across the table and said nothing. But that was the moment I decided I was done being quiet about what I knew. I waited until the room settled. Then I said, calmly and without any particular emphasis, "I reviewed your public filings last month." The room went completely still. My father's expression shifted from surprise to something darker. "You what?" "Your leverage ratio against Cedar Ridge puts 3 of your existing properties at risk if the project misses its first major draw deadline," I said. "Based on the revised timeline, that deadline is now approximately 9 weeks away, and the current cost overrun makes it very unlikely you'll meet the draw conditions." Daniel stood up. "You don't know what you're talking about." I reached into my bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside was a clean, organized summary of the public filings, the financing structure, the draw schedule, and the soil report from the original due diligence package. I had not obtained anything illegally. Every page in that folder was public record. I had simply read it carefully, which was apparently more than anyone else in the room had done. My father picked up the folder and began turning pages slowly. The room stayed quiet. Daniel sat back down. My mother, who had been standing near the kitchen doorway, came fully into the room. After several minutes, my father looked up. "Where did you get this kind of analysis?" he asked. His voice was different than it had been, less certain of itself. "From my firm," I said. He stared at me. "You're what?" I met his eyes directly. "I own Hayes Property Group," I said. "I named it 9 years ago when I started it. I kept the name because it was mine too." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced in that house before. Not the silence of people being polite or waiting their turn. The silence of something fundamental shifting in a room. My father looked at me like he was seeing a person he had not noticed standing there before. And in a way, that was exactly what was happening. "I have been operating for 9 years, I said, keeping my voice level. 14 properties currently under management. 0 loan defaults. 0 legal disputes with contractors or tenants." Daniel laughed, a short, nervous sound that did not match his face. "That's not possible." "It's public record," I said. "You can look it up tonight." My father set the folder down on the table. He was quiet for a long time, looking at it rather than at me. When he finally spoke, I thought for a moment that something real was about to happen between us. That the wall he had built around his understanding of me was finally cracking in a way that would let light through. Instead, he said, slowly and deliberately, "You did all of that, and you still never built anything that actually mattered." I sat with those words for a moment. And then I understood something I had not fully understood before. This was never about what I had or had not accomplished. It was about control. As long as I was lesser in his mind, he was safe. The moment I became real to him, everything he had told himself about our family had to be rearranged. He was not ready to do that. Not yet. The bank called the loan into early review 4 days later. Petra, my former contact at the company, texted me a single line, "They got the letter this morning." Daniel had misreported the projected revenue figures on the original loan application, not fraudulently, but optimistically enough that the gap between projection and reality had become impossible to ignore. The bank had 60 days to work with before their next required action under the loan terms. 60 days was not much time. That evening, Daniel showed up at my house. He did not call ahead. He knocked on my door at 7:30 with his coat still on and his jaw tight. I let him in. I offered him coffee. He declined. He stood in my kitchen and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly and without the smallest hint of please attached to it. Fix it. Just that. 2 words, delivered like an instruction from someone who still believed, even now, that I owed him something. I looked at him for a moment before I answered. I'll think about it, I said. Go home, Daniel. I spent 3 days drafting a legal proposal with my attorney, a sharp and careful woman named Ren Adeyemi, who had handled every significant transaction in my company's history. The proposal was straightforward and completely fair. I would purchase controlling interest in my father's company at current assessed value, assume the outstanding debt obligations, and guarantee the continuation of employment for all current staff. The operations would be restructured under my management. Cedar Ridge would be completed using a revised construction approach that addressed the soil issues properly. The one condition, Daniel would step down from his operational role immediately. He could retain a small ownership stake, but he would have no decision-making authority. I presented it to my father on a Saturday morning at his kitchen table, with Ren present by phone. He read through it carefully. Then he set it down and looked at me. You're trying to take my company, he said. His voice was very quiet, but his eyes were hard. No, I said. I'm trying to save it. There is a difference, and you know there is. He chose Daniel. I had known it was possible. I had even prepared myself for it on the drive over. But knowing something might happen and having it actually happen in front of you are 2 entirely different experiences. He pushed the proposal back across the table and said he believed Daniel could find another solution. That the family should handle family problems without outside interference. Outside interference. I was his daughter. But in that moment I was also the person trying to rearrange his world, and that made me the threat. I picked up the proposal, put it back in my bag, thanked Ren, and stood up. I did not argue. I did not make a speech. I drove home in silence with both hands on the wheel and sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside. The hurt of that moment was different from the hurt of being called worthless at Thanksgiving. That had been sharp and sudden. This was slower and heavier. The specific pain of offering something real to someone who looked at it and turned away. 30 days later, the situation at the company became visible to people outside the family. 2 major vendors froze supply deliveries pending payment on overdue invoices. A subcontractor on the Cedar Ridge site walked off citing unpaid draws. A local business publication ran a brief item about construction delays on a prominent county development, noting that financing complications were being investigated. My mother called me on a Wednesday evening. She did not say much. Just that my father was not sleeping, that Daniel was at the house every day, that the atmosphere was suffocating. He's scared, she said softly. I've never seen him like this. I listened. I told her I loved her. I did not tell her I had a plan, because I was not sure yet whether it would be accepted or rejected again. I came very close to calling my father that night and offering to step in unconditionally, with no terms, just to stop the bleeding. I held the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I put it down. Unconditional rescue was not fairness. It was just a different kind of erasure. My father came to my office on a Thursday morning without an appointment. My assistant, a young man named Kofi who had been with me for 3 years, came to my office door and said simply, "Your father is here." His expression was carefully neutral. I told Kofi to send him in. My father walked into my office and stood in the middle of it for a moment, looking around slowly, at the framed property maps on the wall, at the bookshelves, at the small model of my first building that I kept on the corner of my desk. He looked older than he had at Thanksgiving, smaller in some way I did not have a word for. He sat down across from me and was quiet for a moment. I was wrong, he said finally, about some things. Some things. Not about me specifically. Not about the dinner table, or the word worthless, or 30 years of quiet dismissal. Just some things, left unspecified, floating between us. It was not enough. But it was more than he had ever offered before, and I recognized what it cost him to say even that much. This time I did not offer a partnership. I came back with a full acquisition proposal, a clean purchase of the company at fair market value, assessed independently by a third party that neither of us had any prior relationship with. The price was honest. It was not punitive. Ren had made sure of that. The employees would be retained. The Cedar Ridge project would be completed properly. My father would be offered a formal consulting role with a defined scope and fair compensation. Daniel would be bought out at the same assessed rate as everyone else. Daniel's reaction when my father shared the terms with him was immediate and loud. He called my father that evening. I heard about this from my mother and told him I had engineered the entire situation deliberately. That I had waited for them to fail so I could move in and take what I wanted. That this had been my plan from the beginning. I let him say it. I did not respond to it publicly or privately. When Ren asked me if I wanted to address the accusation formally, I said no. I prepared for this, I told her. I didn't plan it. There's a difference, and the records will show it. The board vote happened on a Tuesday in early April. My father's company had a small independent board, 3 outside members who had been appointed years earlier at the insistence of a previous lender who wanted governance oversight. My father had always considered them a formality. In practice, they had rarely been needed. Now they were needed. The motion before them was straightforward: accept the acquisition proposal from Hayes Property Group or reject it and allow the company to pursue alternative financing that, at this point, no bank in the county had shown any interest in providing. My father did not vote. He sat at the end of the table and watched. Daniel tried to address the board directly before the vote and was reminded that he was not a board member and had no standing to participate in the formal proceeding. The 3 independent members voted unanimously to accept the proposal. I sat across from them and kept my face still. But something in my chest released, slow and quiet, like a breath I had been holding for 9 years. The legal transfer took 6 weeks to complete fully. During that time, I worked alongside Ren and a small transition team to begin the restructuring process. The Cedar Ridge project was paused. The construction approach was revised using the soil mitigation strategy that should have been in the original plan, and a new timeline was established with the bank that satisfied their draw requirements. 3 of the vendors who had frozen deliveries agreed to resume when the new ownership structure was confirmed. The subcontractor who had walked off-site returned after a direct conversation with me about payment terms and project management going forward. My father remained as a consultant. He came into the office 2 days a week and sat in a smaller office than the one he had occupied for 30 years. He did not complain about it, at least not to me. Daniel did not come to the office at all. He received his buyout payment and signed the documentation transferring his stake. He did not look at me when he signed. I did not require him to. About a month after the transfer was complete, my father and I sat alone in what had been his office and was now a general conference room. It was late afternoon. Everyone else had gone home. He had stayed, I think, because he was not yet sure how to leave a building that had carried his name for 25 years without feeling like he was walking away from something essential about himself. We sat with coffee and the quiet of an empty office around us. "You could have told me who you were," he said. Not accusingly, just quietly, as if he was genuinely trying to understand. "I tried," I said. He looked at me. When I was 18, I said. "I tried to show you who I was and what I was capable of, and you were busy deciding who Daniel was going to become. I eventually stopped trying to tell you and just decided to show you. It took a while." He was quiet for a long time after that. There was one thing I had never told him. One piece of the story he did not have. 8 years earlier, when I was still in the early stages of building my company and working under my married name professionally, I had applied for a project manager position at my father's company. I needed the operational experience at scale, and the position was well suited to what I was building toward. I submitted my resume under my married name. I went through the initial screening. I was rejected before the interview stage by the hiring manager, who sent a form letter citing insufficient experience in large-scale residential development. My father had signed off on the department's hiring decisions that quarter. His signature was on the internal approval routing sheet that Petra had included in the documents she sent me, not to expose him, just because it was part of the package. He had rejected my application. Without recognizing me. Without knowing he had turned away the person who would eventually acquire his company. I told him that evening in the conference room. He looked at the table for a very long time before he spoke. 2 months after the acquisition was complete, I called a full company meeting. All staff, all departments, the independent board members, and my father in his consulting role. I stood at the front of the room and talked about where the company had been, what the transition meant, and what the plan was going forward. Near the end, my father raised his hand from the back of the room. I nodded at him. He stood up. He was not a small man physically, but he looked careful in a way he had not looked before, like someone paying close attention to how he placed his words. "I want to say something to this room," he said. "I underestimated my daughter. For a long time. Consistently and completely." His voice caught slightly on the last word, and he cleared it. "She built something real while I wasn't watching. And she saved something I almost lost because someone I trusted wasn't watching either." He sat back down. The room was respectfully quiet for a moment, and then people began to applaud. Not thunderously, just warmly. The way people clap when something true has been said. Afterward, in the parking lot, my father caught up with me before I reached my car. "Why did you keep my name in your company?" he asked. "All those years, building something I knew nothing about. Why name it Hayes?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I wasn't trying to erase you," I said. "I was trying to restore something. Granddad built something real with this name. I wanted to honor that, even if you couldn't see me doing it." I paused. "But I also needed you to feel, for just one moment, what it felt like to be in a room where someone else held the authority and made the decisions. Not forever. Just once. So you would understand what my whole life felt like." He stood with that for a moment. "I do understand," he said. "I'm sorry it took this long." It was the first time in my life he had said those two words to me directly, without qualification, without turning them into something else. I nodded. It was not everything, but it was real, and real was what I had always wanted from him. A year after the acquisition, the company's finances were the healthiest they had been in nearly a decade. Cedar Ridge was completed on the revised timeline. 3 new projects were in early development. The staff who had stayed through the uncertain months received a profit-sharing distribution at the end of the fiscal year. My mother called me when she received the summary statement showing the family's financial position and cried, but in the relieved way, the way you cry when something you were afraid of losing turns out to still be there. My father came into the office regularly. He asked questions more than he gave instructions now, which was new. He sat in on project reviews and listened carefully, and occasionally offered observations that were genuinely useful. Daniel and I did not have a relationship. That was his choice, and I had made my peace with it. One afternoon, a journalist working on a piece about women in property development asked me about my background. She asked whether I had always known I would work in this industry. "I learned by doing," I said. "Not in a classroom, not in a family company. On my own, at night, between everything else life required." She asked if I had anything to prove when I started. I thought about the dinner table. The word worthless. The beer can. The smirk. "Not anymore," I said. The day my father called me worthless was the day I stopped needing to prove anything to him and started building something true for myself. I paused. I was never uneducated. I just learned in places he never thought to look. And it turned out those were exactly the right places.